The woman stood on the porch with her small carpet bag at her feet, shoulders drawn in like she was bracing for a blow that never quite came. "I can sleep in the barn," she said quickly. "I don't need much space, just somewhere dry." The rancher behind her didn't answer right away. Caleb Moore closed the front door instead. The sound of the lock sliding into place echoed louder than it should have. Her breath caught. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll go before morning. I didn't mean to." "No," Caleb said firmly. "You're not sleeping in the barn." She turned, confusion flickering across her face. Fear, too. She had learned the hard way that a man saying no often meant something else entirely. Caleb met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "You're sleeping inside," he said, "and that's final." Her knees nearly gave out. Her name was Ruth. She traveled 3 weeks by train and wagon after answering an advertisement that promised honest work, decent home, respectable man. She'd read the words until they felt like a prayer. By the time she arrived, she'd already prepared herself to be unwanted. Most mail-order brides did. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. Caleb picked up her bag like it weighed nothing. "You're not livestock," he replied. "You don't get put in a stall." He led her down the hall and opened a door she hadn't noticed earlier. The room was simple, clean, a real bed, a quilt folded carefully at the foot. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth. "This is for me." "For as long as you need," Caleb said. Then, after a pause, "The lock's on the outside of the house, not your door." She stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough," he answered. "You asked permission instead of taking. That tells me plenty." The first weeks were awkward. They spoke politely, carefully, like two people afraid of breaking something fragile. Ruth cooked, cleaned, helped in the garden. Caleb worked the land and came home tired but respectful, always knocking before entering a room that was his own house. The town noticed. They always did. Whispers started almost immediately. "She'll leave. She'll cause trouble. No woman comes alone without a past." Ruth heard them. She always did. One night she packed her bag again and left it by the door. Caleb found it before dawn. "You running?" he asked softly. She looked down. "I don't belong." Caleb shook his head. "Belonging isn't something you earn by suffering." He opened the door and moved the bag back to her room. "Stay," he said, "not as an order, as an invitation." Winter came hard that year. A broken fence, a sick calf, long nights where the wind sounded like it wanted inside too. One of those nights, Ruth woke from a nightmare and found herself standing in the hall, shaking. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. Caleb saw her anyway. He put a blanket around her shoulders and sat with her at the kitchen table until her breathing slowed. No questions, no expectations. That was the night Ruth stopped sleeping with her shoes on. Spring followed. So did laughter, hesitant at first, then real. Ruth sang while she worked. Caleb caught himself listening for it when he rode out. The house felt different, less like a shelter, more like a home that had been waiting. One evening, Ruth stood on the porch watching the sun sink into the fields. "I thought when you locked the door," she admitted, "you were shutting me out." Caleb leaned against the rail beside her. "I was keeping the world out," he said, "so you could rest." She nodded, eyes shining. Years later, when people asked how their marriage began, Caleb never mentioned the advertisement. Ruth never mentioned the barn. They talked instead about a locked door, a firm no, and the quiet truth behind it. That sometimes the kindest refusal is the one that says, "You are not lesser. You are not temporary. You belong here." The years after that unfolded gently, like pages turned by hands that finally trusted the ending. Ruth grew roots. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the small ways that mattered. She rearranged the kitchen without asking, planted lavender by the porch, stitched curtains from flour sacks because the windows looked lonely. Each change was a question she no longer had to voice. Each one was answered by Caleb saying nothing at all, which for him meant yes. Caleb changed too. He stopped eating supper standing up. He stopped sleeping with one ear tuned for danger. He started coming home before dark when he could because Ruth waited, not anxiously, not desperately, just there. Like the house itself had learned how to breathe again. The town adjusted slowly. Some women softened first. They saw how Ruth listened more than she spoke, how she brought soup without being asked, how she never pretended to be more than she was. Men followed later, tipping hats, offering help they hadn't before. Respect once earned stayed. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived with unfamiliar handwriting. Ruth stared at it so long Caleb noticed. "You don't have to open it," he said. She shook her head. "I do." It was from her sister, one she hadn't seen in years. Apologies written between the lines. News of a hard life softened by hope. A question at the end, barely daring to exist. "Are you safe?" Ruth folded the letter carefully. "Yes," she said aloud, "I am." She wrote back that night, not with excuses, not with bitterness, just truth. Winter brought illness to the ranch. Caleb took a fall on the North Ridge, came home pale and hurting. For the first time, Ruth saw fear in his eyes, the kind men hide because they think they must. She sat with him through the night, changing cloths, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed yet. When he woke at dawn, he reached for her hand instinctively. "Don't go," he murmured. "I'm not," she said. "I locked the door." He laughed softly, then slept again. Spring returned, stubborn and bright. One morning, Caleb stood in the doorway of Ruth's room, the room that had been hers alone since the beginning. "I never asked you something," he said. She looked up curious. "What's that?" "If you still want this," he said. "Not the roof, not the safety, me." Ruth didn't answer right away. She crossed the room, took his hands, hands that had never once made her feel small. "I chose this the day you told me no," she said, and meant yes. They married quietly. No grand announcement, just a gathering of people who already knew. When Ruth walked into the house afterward, she didn't hesitate, didn't pause, didn't ask where she belonged. She went straight to the kitchen and started supper. Years later, a young woman arrived at the ranch with nowhere to go and fear stitched into her voice. Ruth listened. Caleb watched. When the girl asked, trembling, if she could sleep in the barn, Ruth smiled gently and shook her head. "No," she said, "you're coming inside." And Caleb locked the door behind them, not to trap anyone in, but to make sure the world stayed out long enough for someone new to finally rest. The girl's name was Annie. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching her coat like it might be taken away at any moment, eyes darting to the walls, the table, the lamp, cataloging proof that this place was real, that it wasn't a trick. Ruth noticed the signs immediately. She had worn them once herself. "You can put your things down," Ruth said gently. "Nothing here disappears overnight." Annie nodded, though she didn't let go of her bundle until much later. Caleb stayed back, giving space the way he always did. He poured water, set bread on the table, then stepped outside, pretending to check the latch while the women talked. He knew better than to crowd fear. That night, Annie slept in the same room Ruth once had, the room that seemed to exist solely for people who arrived believing they were temporary. Annie cried in her sleep. Ruth heard it through the thin wall and didn't hesitate. She sat on the edge of the bed, humming softly, not touching until Annie reached out on her own. "I've never stayed anywhere more than a few weeks," Annie whispered. Ruth brushed hair from her face. "Then we'll take this one day at a time." Morning came, slow and bright. Annie offered to leave before breakfast. Ruth handed her a cup of coffee instead. You can help if you want, Ruth said, or you can rest, both are allowed. That seemed to confuse Annie more than anything. Days passed. Annie helped with chores, then stopped asking if she was doing them right. She laughed once, surprised herself when it happened. Caleb heard it from the field and paused, smiling to no one. The town noticed again. It always did. But this time Ruth stood taller. She no longer shrank under questions. When someone hinted, she answered plainly. She's staying until she decides otherwise. That was enough. One evening, Annie found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest like a stone. "Why do you do this?" she asked Ruth. "Why open your door again?" Ruth looked out the window, where Caleb was repairing a fence as the sun dipped low. "Because someone once told me I wasn't allowed to sleep in the barn," she said, "and it changed my life." Annie swallowed. "I'm afraid I'll disappoint you." Ruth turned back to her. "You won't, and even if you do, you'll still be safe." That night Annie slept through until dawn. Years later, much later, the ranch would be known quietly for this very thing, not as a refuge, not as a charity, but as a place where people were treated like people the moment they arrived, where doors closed not in rejection, but in protection, and where a simple word, no, meant, "You are worth more than survival." Time layered itself over the ranch like rings in a tree, each year leaving proof it had passed, none of them wasted. Annie stayed through the summer, then the harvest, then the first frost. Somewhere along the way, she stopped counting days. She stopped flinching when the wind rattled the windows. She stopped packing her bag every Sunday night, just in case. One evening, she brought Ruth a small bundle wrapped in twine. "I made it," Annie said shyly. Inside was a loaf of bread, uneven but warm, the crust cracked just right. Ruth smiled the way women do when they recognize effort more than perfection. "You baked hope into this," she said. "That's the hardest kind." Caleb tasted it later and nodded. "Best bread we've had." Annie beamed like someone who'd just been handed a future. Not everything was easy. There were days Annie went quiet again. Days old memories surfaced without warning. Ruth never asked what happened. She asked, "What do you need?" Sometimes the answer was space. Sometimes it was company. Sometimes it was just sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun lower itself into the land like it belonged there. Caleb built Annie a small desk by the window that winter. "For writing," he said simply. Annie traced the smooth wood with her fingers. "How did you know?" Caleb shrugged. "Everyone needs a place to put their thoughts down." She began writing letters she never sent, stories she never shared. Slowly, her voice found its way back to her, stronger for having been quiet so long. The town, stubborn as ever, softened completely this time. Children came by with scraped knees and stayed for supper. Neighbors brought apples, then stayed to talk. Someone fixed the old church roof. Someone else painted the schoolhouse. No one said why things were better. They just were. One night, long after Annie had grown into herself, she asked Ruth a question she'd been holding for years. "What if I leave someday?" Annie said. "What if I want to try somewhere else?" Ruth took her hands, warm and steady. "Then you'll leave knowing you can come back." Annie nodded, tears slipping free. "That's all I needed." Years later, Annie did leave for a while. She went to study, to work, to build something of her own, and when she returned, older and surer, the porch light was on, just as it had always been. She stood at the door, smiling. Caleb opened it and stepped aside. Ruth didn't ask questions. She just said, "Come in." And Annie understood then what that ranch truly was. Not a shelter, not a rescue, not a miracle. It was a promise kept again and again. That no one who arrives in fear should be made smaller. That safety is not something you ration. And that sometimes the bravest legacy a family can leave is an open door. And the courage to say no, to anything less than dignity.